Hi, everybody.
Hi everyone, I'm trying to get us both on the screen. 1 second. I always seem to press the wrong button there. Wait a second. Let me see if I can no, that's also not it. How do we do this? Yeah, there we go. There we go. Yeah, hi everyone, and welcome to the special Sunday show where we're delighted to do this together. This is myself, Christian Sasse, and also Ian McLaughlin, who is very well known. He's done many live streams on the brain, as you know, as a neuroscientist. So, Ian, would you please just introduce yourself quickly for those who don't know you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I've known Christian for quite a while now. Maybe close to 4 or 5 years at this point? Just kind of baffling to even think about. But anyways, it's a pleasure to get to talk to you. I'm glad to hear that the massive heat wave that was affecting your part of the continent has finally abated. I think I saw an article saying that there was a 195% increase in sudden deaths in a day in British Columbia, which is just bananas.
Yeah,
But yeah, so thanks for having me.
yeah, that's exactly the point. Thanks, Ian. I mean, I'm very keen to have you on the show, especially to talk about the brain because it's interesting. So, why are we doing this today? Well, at the end of June, we had a phenomenal, unprecedented heat wave in British Columbia. It went up to, for those of you who talk in Fahrenheit, it's around 110 and above Fahrenheit, which is crazy at a latitude of 49, where most Canadians may live very close to the US border, as you may know, but it's still quite far north. And that I was just doing some experiments outside and thought, well, it's going to be fun. Let's just put an egg in and let just show how you can make an egg in this heat. And then I realized, to my surprise, well, there were many surprises all the time. And one, I took my phone and realized it wasn't operating anymore. And I thought, my goodness, is it me who's not operating, or is it the phone that's not operating? It's probably both of us. And then Ian will also happen to be on the show, and I thought, gosh, wouldn't it be interesting to talk about the brain and its effects at high temperatures? And that's how this all came about. So, Ian, without further ado, let's jump right into the subject. When we talk about too hot, what do we really mean? Do we mean fever, heat stroke? What is that really about?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is worth considering that I think is a kind of a framework of understanding neurons that we don't necessarily hear a lot, or at least the brain is, when we're thinking about the relationship between heat and the brain in particular, right? Obviously, I focus on the brain. Um, the one important fact is that, our neurons, which is the brain's main ingredient, right? The principal cells within the brain that drive everything from our ability to love and to hate and to hunger, and see and hear this conversation that we're having right now. Our approximately 86 billion neurons consume dramatically more energy than other cells that compose our body. So neurons consume somewhere between 300 and 2,500 times more energy than the average cell in the body. Obviously, that's sort of a loose estimate, but the point is that neurons require a ton of energy to do what they do, which is generate both chemical and electrical signals. But we tend to focus on neurons. There are other cells in the brain that do similar things. But the reason I bring all this up is that all of that energy consumption, um, you know, as is the case with your laptop, your smartphone, right? Everything that consumes energy, all of that energy consumption ultimately generates heat. And as a result, the brain spends a lot of energy ensuring that, both its own temperature as well as the body's temperature stay within a certain range. And so when it comes to, what does too hot mean? So, both mammals like us, other primates and chimps and orangutans and dogs, as well as birds are surprisingly effective at regulating body temperature. And that all depends on the relationships between our brains, our bodies, and most importantly, what we do with our bodies. And so, when it comes to body temperature, and this is independent of states like fevers, it's a very interesting sort of dynamic there. But when it comes to body temperature, it depends on where you're measuring, right? You'll get different temperature readings, and a lot of misconceptions have arisen because the standard human body temperature was based off of measurements over 20,000, 25,000, or measurements of over 25,000 people in the mid 19th century, where all of the temperatures were taken. It's called an axillary temperature, the armpit temperature, which will tend to be different relative to, let's say oral temperature or core temperature, right? But anyways, our core temperature is what our nervous system is most sensitive to, and we have thermoreceptors in a certain part of the brain that literally change shape, right, at different temperatures that will respond to changes in internal temperatures. And we can talk about that mechanism if you like. But what too hot means, and it'll vary, depending upon humidity, very importantly on humidity. You can tolerate much higher temperatures with in an arid climate without very much humidity than you can in, let's say, like Miami or the tropics or whatever. So too hot means when the external world has driven your core body temperature to a point where you can no longer, your temperature control systems fail, right? And that can result in really catastrophic changes in biology in both the brain as well as the body.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, Ian, let me just put up something very fundamental, just because you were talking about humidity and other things. So I'm just going to try and put myself on the screen for 1 second so I can. I'm not sure how to do this, but I'll try like this so that I can share some media with you all. Just to Ian's point here. So give me a second, please. Okay, so if we talk about the body, we have 4 different ways of cooling ourselves. The one is called conduction, and that's what you see here with a swimmer, right? You can see the beautiful butterfly stroke, and actually the body has to produce a lot of heat in order to compensate for the temperature of the water. So, like many of you just wrote in the in the comments, yes, water is exactly the best way to cool down. Now that all works fine as long as the water temperature is lower than your body temperature, right? So that is what we call conduction. So there's another mechanism that you all are too aware of, and that is convection, right? So convection is a good demonstration of forced convection. Again, so what we're doing here is we're cooling the body down by forcing air onto our body. And again, that works very well as long as the ambient temperature is lower than our body temperature, right? So that's the second mechanism. There's a third mechanism, and that's called radiation, as you can see here. So radiation here is absorbing the heat from a source, and the radiation happens all the time, right? So if we go to a warm source, especially in winter, that is radiation. So these are the 3 main sources. Again, that works fine, but if the external source is warmer, then we have to start cooling. If it's warmer than our body temperature, for example, the sun, right? There's a 4th mechanism that is the most important, and that is actually through sweating. Now, sweating alone doesn't cool us, really. It's only sweating. And Ian just mentioned a very important ingredient here, and that's humidity, right? So let's think about this. What is actually happening here to this man and how he's cooling down? First of all, you can see he's taking in a lot of water, which is important, right? And then the body produces sweat by opening the pores, and the sweat alone doesn't cool us. The decisive point now is that in low humidity, when it's very low, what happens is you have evaporation. So the water evaporates at all temperatures, not only at boiling point. It evaporates at all temperatures, and we call this the latent heat of evaporation. And that isn't what we call an endothermic process. So it takes heat actually from the body in order to evaporate, and that cools down the body. It's quite an interesting mechanism. Water has incredibly interesting properties for nature and for all of us, and that is why we are so successful with working with water. Now, the problem is, though, when the humidity outside increases, like Ian just says, so it's very humidity dependent. If we have high humidity, then it's very difficult for this water to evaporate because the air is already saturated a lot with water. And in that case, the body temperature would typically increase, which makes us feel much worse. So typically, if you have a high humidity at, say, in the 80s, you actually feel around a temperature of 100 or 110 simply because of the high humidity. So it's much more difficult for us to cool the body when there's high humidity. So on that note, I'll just jump out of this 1 second And back.
So Christian, when it comes to sweating, there's an interesting dynamic. I think it's intuitive for all of us that people who tend to live in hotter
Mhm.
environments will tend to just tolerate hotter temperatures, right? They'll be less uncomfortable, right, at hotter temperatures. But what happens, there is a sort of adaptive process where people who tend to live in hotter temperatures will tend to just sweat more. However, their sweat tends to be less salty, right? So they're not risking the loss of all of those electrolytes, to a point where
Right.
organs can begin to fail functioning, right? And so your body's adapting over time to your environment, and that's why when you go to a new environment, that where you're not used to the weather in Miami or Philadelphia right now, it's extremely humid today and hot. But all of a sudden you're just like, oh my God, this is just intolerable. Whereas other people are just fine. It's interesting, all these, completely unconscious automatic processes that help us to adapt to environments over which we have no control. They just happen to us.
That's absolutely right. And you were talking about all these deaths that we had in British Columbia that were also unprecedented. It's so difficult to cope with that. But let's jump back right into the topics now, Ian, and really get to the to the interesting questions now of what happens when it gets so hot. So what happens to the brain and how can we prevent this? This is your chance really to, to explain us all about the brain and how that works.
Okay, well, so obviously, it's a little complicated, and so you'll have to stop me when I'm getting a little too granular. But at a
Go ahead.
fundamental level, at a fundamental level, we have a ton of different types of proteins that execute various reactions, right? And so here I have a little video that's sort of famous at this point. Let's see if it'll play. Yeah. So, oh shoot, you know what I should do is let's do continuously loop. Okay. Let me restart that. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so this is a tiny little microscopic protein that's active right now in your brain, in your body. It's an enzyme that literally functions this way. It looks almost like it's walking, right? It looks like it's taking steps along this train track, and that's how various molecules are shuffled throughout the brain and body, right? It's an enzyme called kinesin. And so, but what you're seeing, I mean, this is a very, very small protein. You're almost able to see, the single amino acids that compose it, right? A protein is just a string of sort of complicated molecules connected together that then, depending upon what the sequence is, those proteins will do different things. A muscle protein, you can have the types of proteins that release neurotransmitter. You have a ton of different kinds. And so, but what the problem is that, like all chemistry, the ambient temperature will influence how that protein functions. And so you can see it's sort of squiggly and wiggly, right? It has to be so it can move. At too cold of a temperature, it becomes very, very difficult for those amino acids to be able to move. At too high a temperature, and those feet are going to go nuts, right? There'll be a ton more sort of just like random movements, right? Which will interfere with this protein's ability to predictably walk along its train track, right? And so that's at the most fundamental level why the brain spends so much energy regulating body temperature and brain temperature. And there can be differences between brain temperature and body temperature. But so fundamentally, we have a sort of thermostat in our brain. And it's a part of the brain that you might be familiar with. It's called the hypothalamus, right? And so when it comes to, so it's like a thermostat, but it's powered by sugar and protein and fat, right? As opposed to electricity. And so, the thermostat can move around and make tools and put on clothes, right? Because of course it's connected to our brain and our body. Here. So yeah, so this is the thermostat in our brain, right? The hypothalamus. I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but it is sort of like right there, right in the middle of the brain. It's actually a brain region that I studied. But anyways, that's where your thermostat is. And so, I could go on and on about how cool the hypothalamus is, particularly the lateral hypothalamus. So like really quickly, if Christian were to just immediately transport himself to Philadelphia, which I'm not entirely sure he's incapable of doing, but if he were to do that and implant an electrode right into my lateral hypothalamus, a certain part of the hypothalamus, and he gave me a button that would enable me to stimulate that brain region at will, I would sit here drooling, just constantly hitting that button because it feels so good, right? And so the hypothalamus has a ton of functionality. It influences everything that we feel, we think, and we do. And it influences some of the most basic things that our brain and body does, right? Things like hunger, right? And, body temperature. And so it's one of the few parts of the brain that has a region of it that lacks a blood-brain barrier, right? The protective barrier that prevents various molecules that are circulating within your body to get into your brain. It's very important that, let's say viruses don't get into your brain, but also other molecules that would interfere with neuronal activity. So certain parts of the brain actually have a little gap, a little window. And what that does is it enables those brain regions to sort of sample what's going on throughout the body, right? How high are the levels of various molecules? So for example, when somebody has too much to drink, right? Or takes too much of pretty much any drug, a different part of the brain, not the hypothalamus, different part of the brain that lacks a blood-brain barrier will detect that the levels of these molecules are so high, and it'll automatically induce a vomit reflex, right? And so that's what's happening, right? Is that your brain is detecting this molecule is too high. The only way that we evolved for molecules to get into our bodies was by eating, and so therefore we vomit. So in the hypothalamus, similar type of function there, but what's happening is that the hypothalamus is sampling, a different sort of repertoire of molecules, some of which, for example, are called pyrogens. Okay, so pyrogens, these are the molecules that actually cause fever, right? Which basically causes our baseline body temperature to increase, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. A lot of misconceptions around what a fever is and how dangerous it is. But anyway, so there are specific neurons within the hypothalamus that detect the levels of these molecules and adjust your body temperature this way or that accordingly. And it has a bunch of different tools in its toolbox, a bunch of different levers that it can pull to adjust body temperature, inducing sweating, for example, vasoconstriction, vasodilation, these types of things, moving, just like causing you to shiver, right, to generate body heat, something like. And I was actually surprised to read this. Something like 80% of the energy that it takes to move, just move, is lost to heat. And so that's why shivering, you can't control it, but it is generating a good amount of heat for you. But anyway, so that's the sort of the basics of what's going on in the brain, or the main thermostat in the brain that enables it to automatically regulate, just like a thermostat, what's going on in your body under normal healthy conditions, under disease conditions, right? Various diseases can cause a sort of predictable change in body temperature, and then as well as in sort of pathological, like pathogenic situations where you're infected by a bacteria and a virus. Notoriously, SARS coronavirus 2 causes extremely high fevers, and that's the mechanism. It is the hypothalamus that is causing those changes in body temperature.
Yeah, Ian, just a quick note on the hypothalamus, and I'm certainly absolutely novice here, so excuse the simple question. But what happens when the temperature varies of the hypothalamus? Aren't we very susceptible to the way we behave?
When specifically within the brain, or just
Yes.
the behaviors that.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I mean, for sure, right? So there will be discrepancies between the temperature within the brain and within the body. Not giant differences, but there will be differences. And I mean that's true no matter where you measure temperature, right? As we were saying earlier, if you measure temperature in the armpit, it's going to be predictably different than orally or internal temperatures. And so, yeah, absolutely, that will influence, how the hypothalamus is regulating body temperature in general. However, if there are significant fluctuations in brain temperature, that can be extremely dangerous for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being disruption of all these proteins functioning. But also it can make the regulatory responsibilities of a bunch of brain regions go haywire. And so all of a sudden it's like you're driving a car, but you can't see. Right. And so, your ability to respond to traffic conditions is all of a sudden compromised. Right. So it's sort of a similar function or similar dynamic here, where the hypothalamus is it's not calibrated anymore. It's decalibrated. And so it can't regulate body temperature along with a whole variety of other functions. Are you there? Oh, Christian, it looks like you're muted.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Come again. I'm just going to throw a quick question here from David Howden. I find it absolutely fascinating because I was looking at it myself. Does this apply to all animals, all warm-blooded animals, or some subset of life? I think it's a great question. Ian.
Well, yeah. So what's interesting is so humans are sort of shockingly good at regulating body temperature. We're probably
Mhm.
the best at regulating body temperature, strangely, certainly among other primates, right? And there's a whole lovely sort of evolution. Oh no, there's a whole like lovely evolution to evolutionary history behind our ability to to regulate our body temperature so much. But if you think about, for example, other primates, right? They're covered in fur, right? And of course, they didn't really they would stay pretty much within their habitat, right? They wouldn't necessarily, you're not going to see a chimpanzee necessarily, traipsing off into the desert, or the savannas of Africa like we did. And probably one of the only reasons that we could, our ancestors, of course, not us, but our ancestors could, was because we lacked all that fur. And it turns out we have significantly more sweat glands than any other animal, right? And that includes other primates. And so as a result, right, dogs, for example, have a sort of very classic, famous way of regulating their body temperature because they don't really have sweat glands like we do, certainly, and they're covered in fur. They pant, and panting, breath, as well as skin radiating heat. Those are like essentially the only two ways that we really effectively regulate body temperature. So we have all these sweat glands that enable us to benefit from the dynamic that Christian was explaining, sweating, right?
Yeah.
Evaporation.
And that's interesting because if you then, Ian, jump to cold-blooded animals, it gets really curious, right? Because you can have drastic temperature changes as they go from the shade to heat, to into the sun. And if you look at insects, most of them with their exoskeleton, I'm sure Isa would love to talk about this. It gets even more interesting because they can have temperature variations because they have such a large surface area to volume ratio because they're so tiny. They can have drastic temperature changes within a few degrees in just a few seconds. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the solutions that different animals have come up with to regulate body temperature are really amazing. So for example, rodents, right? They have these sort of creepy, sort of, unless you're used to rodents like I am, creepy tails, right? That are sort of fleshy and exposed, right? They don't have fur on them. That is one of the ways that rodents regulate their body temperature,
Mhm.
right? As opposed to all of our sweat glands. We have, I keep harping on sweat glands. Obviously, it's pretty central to body temperature, but we have 10 times the sweat glands that chimpanzees have, which, by the way, chimpanzees have almost 99% identical genome, right, relative to us. So this is a pretty important difference. Another interesting thing is where they came from. So it turns out that most other mammals have sweat glands in their hands and their feet, right? Not throughout their body. So why would that be? Well, adding a little bit of water when you're, gripping and jumping around, trees and stuff like that improves your ability to grasp those things, right? It increases friction. And so, so it very well might have been the case that it just so happened, hey, that was pretty effective. And over time, our ancestors who had those sweat glands sort of expand throughout the rest of their body as they were losing fur, right, were able to expand into, environments with temperatures that are significantly higher than a chimpanzee could ever tolerate, right? And so it's interesting, there's a bunch of different things in the evolution of humans that are like, if this didn't happen, humans couldn't exist, right? There's a bunch of them, but definitely one of them is the loss of our fur and the expansion of our sweat glands.
Yes, I'm just putting a question here from Gemma. I just put it on the screen. Are cats the same? I remember mine when it was sick, it was so hot, my cat was doing some strange panting. Yeah, exactly. Or something. Generally, you don't see that in domestic cats. Yes. Ian, do you have any comment on the cat specifically?
Interesting. Well, I haven't read specifically how it is that cats behaviorally regulate their body temperature. I suspect it must be through mostly panting.
Yes,
However,
it is. It is.
um,
It is. Yeah. Yeah. I
but
would think so.
like a lot of animals, so rabbits, for example, have these big, beautiful ears, right? And it turns out that part of the reason that those ears are so important is that they are sort of heat sinks, essentially heat radiators. They just like give off heat. And so that is, and cats have, ears sort of like that too, and dogs do too. But yeah, the purpose of those ears isn't exclusively auditory. Like a lot of things, it turns out that they're very important for body temperature. Which is, one of those things that I think we sort of underestimate the importance, right? We don't really think about it until it becomes a problem. And when it does become a problem, there's a lot of misconceptions regarding body, what is the normal body temperature? Or when somebody has a fever, what should you do, right? Is a fever itself dangerous, which we can talk about if you'd like.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Scott is talking something very interesting here about scalability, which I really like. So he says, if we could magically make the mouse the size of an elephant, it would die almost immediately from overheating. And if we could make an elephant the size of a mouse, we could see the same. Saw this in Kurzgesagt, which is a German word, by the way. Yes, you're absolutely right. So that's completely correct. So.
Yeah, and so Scott also brought up, what we all think is the sort of the average body temperature, and I sort of brought this up, and so here, using this thermometer, a scientist in the mid 18th or 19th century named Wunderlich literally measured the body temperatures of 25,000 people, right? Which is a lot of people, particularly back in those days.
You're serious, huh?
25,000, I think over 1 million readings, and this is over the course of several years. Right. It's that old school brute force science, right? That is very, very helpful. But there are some problems with it, right? But so basically, Wunderlich came to the sort of the average body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius, about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's what came to be considered to be normal body temperature. But even he never actually said that should be considered the normal body temperature, just that it was the average temperature. And so we're looking at one of the thermometers that he used right there. Old school mercury thermometer, which tend to be very, very accurate, actually. But it turned out that with his thermometer, which you can see here in Philadelphia at one of my favorite places in the world, the Mutter Museum, but his thermometer turned out to be calibrated such that it was measuring 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warmer than it actually should have. Difficult to set a standard, right, back in those days, but so as a result, all of those readings that he was taking, well, and he probably, of course, was using multiple thermometers, not just one, but even just, using one regularly that is calibrated this way, that's decalibrated this way, would introduce this, systematic error. And also, as I was saying, he was taking axillary temperatures in the armpit, which we know tend to be lower than things like oral temperature, true body core temperature. And so, all of these things combined, right, or result in the misconception that if your body temperature isn't 98.6 Fahrenheit, 37 Celsius, then there's something wrong with you. But the reality is, any human's natural body temperature will first of all vary over the course of a single day, right? And so, another problem is that if you're taking body temperature measurements at the same time every day, and you're taking that to be the standard body temperature, that's going to be incorrect, right? Because just a couple hours later, that same person is going to have a different body temperature. Things like menstruation, right? Before ovulation is when a woman's body temperature will be at its lowest, right? That is like a way to predict when ovulation is going to occur. And so anyways, all of this to say that among the many misconceptions regarding body temperature, what it is to be normal is a misconception. And that actually results in a lot of problems. So first of all, I think it's safe to say most physicians actually behave according to this standard, right? If you're not 98.6, obviously I'm not criticizing, physicians, but, like even within a hospital, they have to work with some kind of standard. And that's the standard that's still used in most hospitals. What, the best thing to do, which is also probably impossible, certainly in the United States and the way our healthcare is devised, but would be to set, what is, Christian Zasa's normal baseline body temperature, right? And then go from there. But pretty difficult to do that, right? When you have, dozens and dozens of patients, and when you only see a patient when they come in for an emergency, right? And so, and then even within hospitals, different physicians, different clinicians, right? Nurses, medical practitioners will operate according to different sort of frames of what is a healthy body temperature, what is the threshold beyond which something is wrong, right? Somebody has a fever, some will go with 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and that anything above that is a fever. which is, not necessarily true. It's a gradient, right? Whereas others will say, you got to be 101 for me to care about it. Others will say 100 degrees, right? And that's a fever. And so, yeah, all of these misconceptions arose from what was really impressive science at the time in the mid 19th century, but then just became misconstrued through this game of telephone, and now we all think we should all have 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit body temperature, otherwise we're unhealthy, and it's just not the case.
Yeah, we have a lot of interesting comments here, especially about temperature. So Georgia says, I've always heard the explanation that more people tended to be sick back then. So back then, what you're just talking about, right? Sorry, I just lost it. The screen scrolled.
Yeah, I got it. So I always heard the explanation that more people tended to be sick back then. Yes. So average ended up being higher. The thermometer calibration thing makes more sense though. No, Georgia, you're absolutely right. That also was a problem, right? Where the average life expectancy, another thing that, where there's a lot of misconceptions, was 40 years old when Wunderlich was conducting his experiments. 40 years old. And that's due to a variety of reasons, not the least of which being nutrition. But also, people just tended to be just the baseline inflammation in the body, right? You're exposed to more pathogens. Hygiene was essentially non-existent, at least relative to today's standards. So people just likely had, just a sort of low-grade inflammatory baseline that was higher, right, than any of us right now today, at least, unless, of course, you're ill. And then also, just clinical science at the time, we didn't even have a sort of normal body temperature till Wunderlich conducted his experiments. And so a lot of these patients almost certainly had, occult tumors or, cancers about which they had no idea, that they were completely unaware of. Cancer is well known to elevate body temperature. And so all of these things combined to, you're right. It was just a different population back then, right? And so you're absolutely right to bring that up.
Okay, let's put the temperature discussion aside. I mean, measuring temperature is very difficult. It really is. I've worked a lot in a lab, so I completely get it. But let's assume for one moment that you're sitting in a sauna and the temperature is slowly increased, and you can measure the temperature of the sauna very well. So eventually, let's say you get dehydrated and your body just increases with the temperature. What actually happens with you? Do you become delusional? What is the state of mind that you're going through there?
Sorry, you cut out for a second, but I think I got you. So
okay,
right. When you're so a bunch of different things can happen, right? Probably the most dangerous, and it's actually life-threatening. I think a lot of people use this term sort of treat it trivially, right? But you can have a heat stroke. Right. And so, obviously heat stroke is when the body gets too hot, obviously. Right. But generally speaking, when we get to around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, about 40 degrees Celsius, that's sort of when temperatures become dangerous. Right. If they're sustained at that level for a long period of time. And it can result in organ failure. It can result in seizure. And it is genuinely life threatening. Right. There's heat exhaustion, which is, less severe. It's less life threatening. But when somebody's having a heat stroke, that is an emergency situation when you need immediate medical attention. Otherwise, organ failure can occur and damage to the brain. And what can happen beyond just, again, disrupting all these beautiful little proteins that we have, throughout our brain and body, with the heat, disrupting their ability to perform their functions. Excessive heat can begin to activate inflammatory responses, right? Inflammatory responses in our immune system. As though you've been infected by something, right? Or hit by something that would cause a bruise, which, by the way, you might have noticed that when you are, hit by something and causes a bruise, you can feel it's warm right there, right? It's warm at the site. Mm-hmm. That is the byproduct of all of this inflammatory activity, literally releasing molecules that circulate up to your hypothalamus, again, our good friend, the hypothalamus, and cause the hypothalamus to then elevate body temperature. So it's the same molecules that are causing your bruise to be warm, or what would cause your brain to make your body warm. But anyway, so all of that combined, and your ability to regulate body temperature, things like sweating, begin to fail, right? You're getting all of that combined into a very, very dangerous state where people can have permanent brain damage. And certainly before that happens, you will have the types of exotic experiences that you're describing, Christian, like hallucinations, delusions, these types of things, because the brain is, all of those proteins aren't functioning the way they ought to be, right? And so those neurons aren't signaling under normal conditions, and as a result, our states of consciousness are actually fairly fragile things. Right? Just a little bit of one molecule, a little bit of alcohol changed your state of consciousness. Well, if you have this global change in neuronal activation due to this unusually raised external temperature, same kind of things can happen, but unfortunately with more tragic consequences. And then but before heat stroke, right, we can have heat exhaustion, which is quite a bit more common, quite a bit less dangerous. But and this is, of course, when the body's exposed to excessive heat. But when you've been sweating, right, which we all do when we're exposed to excessive heat, you begin, if that continues, you begin to lose too much water and salt, right?
Yes.
Both of which are very, very important for the function of a variety of organ systems. At least when it comes to the brain, some of the most, you hear the term electrolytes, right, which are obviously over marketed, right? They're not as important as Gatorade would like you to believe, at least for most people, right? But they are critical salts essentially in the brain. So sodium, potassium, calcium, right? These are molecules, or these are actually ions, but that are lost in sweating, right? That's part of your sweat. And so if you begin to reach levels of sodium that are too low, literally like the fundamental gears of what enable neurons to fire impulses, fire action potentials, is unavailable, right? And so all of a sudden, neurons are no longer able to be in a state where they're ready to fire impulses, and they just shut down, right? And so that's why when we were talking about people who acclimate to various hotter temperatures, they will tend to sweat more than somebody who's not used to it, somebody perhaps who lives in British Columbia or in Vancouver, right? Who's just not used to those elevated temperatures that were so high for so long, right? They won't sweat as much, but then also somebody who's acclimated to higher temperatures won't lose as much salt, despite the fact that they're sweating more, right? To preserve those very, very important, or those ions, those atoms that are very, very important to our nervous system, without which, neurons begin to fail. Right, they begin to be capable of functioning.
Ian, that's a great point. So you are obviously suggesting here that it is possible for the body to adapt to higher temperatures, which probably we are even doing here in British Columbia. However, there must be a limit to what we can adapt, right? I mean, it cannot go on for infinite temperatures. That's not possible. There's a temperature where proteins and enzymes break down no matter what. It just doesn't work anymore, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. I mean, but it is remarkable how adaptable the human body and brain is. But yeah, of course, absolutely. And as we were saying, higher humidity makes that threshold beyond which you can't adapt anymore much lower than, let's say, in Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, right, where it's very, very hot, but also very, very dry. You can just tolerate much higher temperatures. But yeah, absolutely, right. Once you get to a certain temperature, all those beautiful little proteins walking along our train tracks, right? They can just begin to deteriorate, right? Lose amino acids or engage in chemical reactions that they otherwise couldn't, right? They begin to influence other neuronal, cascades that then, disrupt the activities of neurons.
It's interesting, Ian, because we have obviously through evolution lost a lot of our hair, our body hair. Maybe that is the wrong way. As the temperature increases, we probably should look more like a camel or so, get a lot more fur to actually protect us from heat. I don't know what it's just a loose comment, but I think there's some truth in it.
That's interesting. I guess, I have ridden a camel, actually, believe it or not. Very strange, very strange. Not as ergonomic, not as comfy as like a horse, but they're really remarkable animals. But yeah, I do wonder that, if a camel were hairless, like an elephant, let's say, if they would be more or less tolerant of heat. I would imagine that they would be more tolerant, but they would also be exposed to constant sunlight, ultraviolet radiation, which would then potentially disrupt, or cause, carcinogenic activity, cause cancers, right? Or, destroy genetic information in the skin. I would imagine that. And then the other thing, of course, is elephants, just like pigs, by the way, notoriously bathe in mud, right? They love
They
mud,
do.
and
They do.
one of the
Yes.
reasons that pigs and
Mm.
elephants love mud specifically is body temperature regulation, right? They don't have sweat glands like we do. And so they just cover themselves and they just cake on the mud to literally protect them as like it's like sunglasses, right, for their skin. But yeah, that's an interesting thought.
Yeah, it's the same. I read that they have a special type of clothes now for high humidity because I mean, in high humidity and high temperatures, we can't sweat really. No, sorry, we can't exchange heat. I should say we do sweat, but we can't exchange heat. But there seems to be a special type of clothes where they can remove the sweat from the body in order for us to cool the to be able to cool the body. It's quite interesting. Yeah. So,
Interesting. I have to get some
yeah.
of those.
Yeah. Yeah, that's no, that's I think we've answered all the a lot of the questions here. I'm just trying to see if there's any other uh, topic that's Ian, is there anything else you would like to mention?
Yeah, so actually Frank over on YouTube brings up the the concept that at a temperature of around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously,
Mhm.
a fever at that temperature, proteins denature, right? And is there evidence of this in the brain also? So what you're talking about, denaturing proteins, is exactly what I'm describing with this little enzyme of ours, right? When a protein denatures, that means it's a literal confirmation. Its shape will change, and there's a sort of complicated chemistry underlying that, right? Where
Mhm.
certain interactions between different parts of the protein are able to happen now because there's enough energy in the system because it's hot enough that now you can get all kinds of wacky conformations that have nothing to do with its function. But different proteins will denature at different temperatures. 104 is, definitely pretty bad. But what's interesting, the reason I wanted to expand on this is that I think, a lot of folks think that it is the fever itself that's life threatening. But really, fevers themselves aren't a big deal or aren't the big deal. They're more of an indication of something else that is a big deal that's happening in the body potentially, right? So unless a fever starts hitting 104 degrees, right, which is what you're talking about, 40 degrees Celsius, it's really not the primary medical concern. The primary concern is whatever it is that's causing the fever in the first place, right? It's sort of like a sign that something is wrong. And the only reason I bring this up is that I think a lot of people will really focus on the fever itself, treating the fever, rather than focusing on whatever it is that's causing the fever. And by that, I mean, if somebody's suffering from a fever, right, the primary goal isn't necessarily to reduce body temperature, right? Is to address the root cause. And so, unless a person's temperature is getting really, really high, right, like, body temperature, closer to 108 degrees, right?
Mhm.
Generally speaking, focusing on body temperature isn't where a caregiver's primary energy is going to be devoted. And it's that just one of the sort of like common misconceptions about along with like what a normal body temperature is. And by the way, fevers are actually adaptive, right? They're helpful. And at the simplest level, right, a fever is just when our body temperature is unusually high. However, it must not be due to something like exertion, right? It has to be there should be no obvious cause for that elevated body temperature. That is technically what a fever is. And so there's an interesting biology underlying why it is and how it is that we have them, but there is an adaptive function, right, where elevated body temperature enables a lot of interactions within the body that wouldn't normally happen, right? Under healthy conditions, and that can help to fight off whatever pathogen is causing the fever. I can't help it, but there's a quote from an old school physician named William Osler, right? And his quote is humanity has three great enemies: fever, famine, and war. And by far the greatest, by far the most terrible is fever.
Okay.
And so, I only mentioned the name Osler because one of the roads that led to my lab when I was in graduate school was named after him. So I saw his name every day. but anyways, I think that's probably a bit of a misconception, right? It's the pathogens that's causing the fevers. I'm sure he would agree at this point. But anyways, yeah. So that sort of misconception that like, if somebody's at 101 degrees Fahrenheit or 102, that you got to put them in an ice bath, right? Because you can't let their body temperature go too high. You still have a good amount of wiggle room when you have a fever at that level. And really what you should focus on is like probably eating a lot and sleeping a lot, right? If you have a viral infection, or if there's an viral medication, of course, that can always help. Or if it's a bacterial infection, obviously antibiotics. But yeah, okay, that's just one of those misconceptions that I always
Yeah, it's
I think
interesting
it's fun to engage.
It's interesting what Georgia just wrote. I saw a study once where administering fewer reducers meant staying sick longer, but not feeling as severely sick as at any given moment. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then another thing is what a lot of those medications are doing, except for acetaminophen or paracetamol, as it's called in other countries outside of the U.S. What those drugs are doing, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, salicylic or aspirin, sodium, right? These types of drugs, medications, over-the-counter medications. What they're doing is they're directly interfering with the mechanism that releases the molecules called pyrogens. Very cool word, fire generators. They're literally interfering with the ability of those molecules to be released into the bloodstream, and then it is those specific molecules that trigger within the hypothalamus that elevated body temperature, right? Through a molecule called prostaglandin 2 is released. In by the way, the preoptic hypothalamus, if anybody's interested. But anyway, so that is what those drugs are doing. But those pyrogens, those molecules are released. That's part of the inflammatory cascade, right? And so not only do they elevate body temperature, I mean, and not necessarily the pyrogens, but those same molecules that cause elevated body temperature also are perceived as painful, right? And so that's why you get that sort of arthritic-like pain when you get the flu, or COVID-19 can cause that. Even if you can have a reaction to vaccination, right, where you feel as though you're sick even though obviously you're not sick. It's because you're having an inflammatory reaction, which is a good thing, right? That means the immune system is responding, it's being educated, but it is, as a result, inherently going to release some of those inflammatory molecules that then are perceived as inflammation, just like as if you got a bruise, and that's why you get those aches. And so those drugs are, yes, preventing you from having a fever, but then they're also preventing those inflammatory molecules from being perceived at your joints and stuff as causing that pain. But of course, you're interfering with one of the sort of principal biochemical cascades that evolved to fight off pathogen in our body. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, I'm glad that we have them. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, you don't necessarily want to at all costs reduce body temperature.
So, Ian, what would happen? I mean, in an extreme situation now. So we're always talking about one temperature, of the environment and so on. But let's take an extreme case where half of our body is at cooler temperature. Let's say we're putting legs into a swimming pool, and the upper half is hotter. How does the body really regulate this? This must be very difficult, right? So.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, so the way, what the brain relies on are, essentially thermoreceptors, right? These are little proteins that will change conformation, change shape under a certain, window of temperature, right? And so, without that is the sensor that the brain uses. And we have them all throughout our body, right? In some places, maybe a little bit more densely populated with them than others, but that's what the brain is using. And so, you'll have them in your legs, you'll have them in your body, and that discrepancy will just be perceived as that difference in temperature. But an interesting dynamic is of course going to be the heat exchange that's occurring in the colder parts of the body. But another interesting feature of those receptors, if you ever so my 2.5-year-old daughter loves jalapeno chips, right? She loves them. She actually really likes spicy food, like a lot. And it's kind of strange. I'm not really used to seeing a baby like really, really into, spicy food. But if you watch, their natural reaction is like, this is hot, and they'll start like panting as though that's going to do anything. But it's not. But she's not wrong, right? Her brain is telling her that right now my mouth is hot. And that is because the same exact receptor that is responsible for detecting fluctuations in temperature, TRPV1 channel, that same thing is what's being bound by the molecule that gives jalapenos, habaneros, the Carolina Reaper, its spiciness, capsaicin, right? And so that molecule is interacting with our body temperature system, such that she's not wrong, right? I mean, she's wrong that it's going to help, but but it is being perceived as heat. And there's an interesting dynamic as to like why it is that people dig. I like spicy food too now. After I had a Sichuan dish here in Philadelphia. Oh my God, my mouth is watering right now. But
Yeah, you should give her.
interesting dynamic.
Scott's just saying you should start giving her Indian food while she's young. Okay.
Yeah, dude, she's had it. I mean, not like Vindaloo or not some of those crazy like torture devices in the form of food, but yeah, she digs it. Like tikka masala, she loves it. It's just kind of surprising, I'm sure it's not all that unique. Certainly, obviously not in India, but yeah, it is pretty funny to watch her react to the first time. Was so funny because she was like, what, and then she was like not super into it, but then about a minute later she was like, give me some more of that, which is very cute. But yeah, it's an interesting system.
Yeah, I'm just looking through some other comments here. There was one, I don't know where I saw it. I just remember it. Have you heard of the astrovirus? I'm just throwing this in. I don't know if you can comment on that, Ian.
Astrovirus.
I saw it somewhere. I don't remember. It's just in my head somewhere. I saw it.
Astrovirus. I know.
Astrovirus.
This is interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to find the company. I'm trying to remember as many as I can as I read. But
oh, is it a type of virus like
yes.
yeah?
I think that's what it meant.
Okay, yeah. So like an astrovirus, that's sort of like saying it's like it's like saying Indian food, right? Where there's a bunch of different dishes that all qualify as being Indian food. It's a
generic name, right? So
yeah, it's a whole collection of different specific viruses that will cause different diseases. It's a sort of a shape, essentially, sort of like coronavirus, actually, right? A coronavirus is really just a category of a bunch of viruses, which we've been struggling and battling with for the past year and a half. But and then SARS coronavirus 2 is a type of coronavirus. Same thing goes with astroviruses. But thank you. I had never heard that term. That's pretty cool.
Okay.
Well, on the topic of viruses, I can't help it just because it's so cool. There is a category of virus called giant viruses. Okay, and maybe I'll talk about this another time at some point. I've wanted to for a long time, but these viruses are bigger than some bacteria. Viruses are very small, very, very, very small, almost always. Giant viruses almost look as though they are organisms, like they're life forms. They're so huge, and there are thousands and thousands of different types of giant viruses, none of which really threaten us, it turns out, at least as far as we know. But they are an example of where a lot of scientists don't consider viruses to be life or to be alive, and there's some good reasons for that. But giant viruses really begin to blur those lines, right? It looks, if when I look at them, they almost look like the sort of line of viruses almost developing into something that could be considered a life form, but not quite. So yeah, everybody should check that out and enjoy science fiction imagination going wild when you see these wacky things.
Yeah, there's one other topic that you may or may not find interesting to discuss, but that was one of the papers I thought it's the effect of moderate heat stress on auditory brainstem evoked response in man. And I don't know if you quickly want to talk about that. I found it rather interesting. So with apparently with heat stress, the response or the latency decreases. I found that very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's fat. I mean, yeah, that was a sort of like a classic style experiment, or set of experiments. I don't have very many insights on the mechanism there. It's pretty interesting, but when it comes to heat stress, there are some really interesting things that happen in the body, throughout the body, right? We have this whole category of proteins called heat shock proteins, right? And I think at this point, a lot of us are familiar with the fact that saunas and steam rooms, these types of things, as well as like ice baths or cryotherapy, right? Where you're for about 2 minutes, you're in this chamber of like liquid nitrogen. Well, not liquid nitrogen, but you're being cooled down to like really, really absurdly low temperatures for just a couple of minutes. Same with saunas and stuff. There are a bunch of really interesting responses throughout the body and brain that in response to those radical changes in body temperature, not the least of which being heat shock proteins. And what those heat shock proteins do is, they are one category of a variety of different mechanisms within our cells that are responsible for responding to some aberrant activity within the cell, right? A protein isn't folded correctly or isn't manufactured correctly, right? Heat shock proteins can respond and mitigate the consequences of an aberrant protein, which can result in carcinogenic or cancerous growth. It can disrupt normal cellular function. It can cause cells to die, right, or become senescent. And so heat shock proteins are sort of like one of the main mechanisms by which cells sort of surveil themselves and ensure that things are functioning properly. And so when you elevate, just the sort of and they can also recognize and respond to aberrant genetic activity, right, where there's an error in whatever a gene that's being copied as cells are dividing. They can respond to that and either correct it or kill the cell before something bad happens, right? And so heat shock, right, whether it's
Yes.
super duper cold or super duper hot, elevates the activity of those proteins, which can be associated with, there are like really interesting studies that have been done in different animals where the lifespan of these animals can just be like doubled, tripled, quintupled. Obviously, these are things like worms or mice or things like that. But that is very likely one of the mechanisms by which enjoying a sauna or doing this cryotherapy thing is actually beneficial, right, and could potentially extend lifespan. It's a really interesting dynamic. And obviously a lot more happens than just elevation of heat shock proteins when you're exposed to those temperatures. But yeah, it is an adaptive process. And it's interesting to see all of these cultures over the years that they'll like put on what is this? This is like in Russia and Scandinavia, where they'll just wear these like little swimming trunks. I'm sure in Canada as well, and just dive into ice water.
They would.
Right? It's just bananas. Like, I cannot imagine doing that. And they'll be in a sauna and then they'll jump into the snow. And it's like they're just doing it. They're just doing it naturally, right? They don't know anything about heat shock proteins, but it is actually beneficial.
I did it in Sweden too, by the way. Well, you won't believe it. I did it.
Is that right? Jeez, I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could tolerate it.
But it wasn't. It was tough. I thought it was very tough. Anyway, Frank comes up with another interesting question. It's the correlation of brain temperature to physiological conditions like schizophrenia. Is there a relationship between them, really? So
that's super interesting. Yeah. So I think Frank is like referring to conditions that aren't like somatic, I guess, or not things like cancer or diabetes or things like that, but psychological conditions or psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia. So I don't know that. What's interesting about that can happen in schizophrenia is that sort of thermoregulatory mechanism that enables us to know what the ambient temperature is can be completely disrupted, right? And so as a result, folks with schizophrenia can just constantly feel like they're super cold, or the inverse, right? And so sometimes you'll see somebody who has a severe mental illness and it's super hot out, right? And they're wearing like a Canada Goose jacket, right? It's as though they're in the Arctic. And it's just obvious, right, that there's something different about their thermoregulatory system. So that can happen in schizophrenia. Other similar sort of disruptions, like if somebody's hypo or hyperthyroid, Graves or Hashimoto's, right? What can happen if you're hyperthyroid, right? There's a bunch of ramifications. Thyroid is one of those hormones that's like responsible for everything. But somebody who's hyperthyroid will oftentimes, behave as though they're hot, right? They will sweat more. They'll move around. Not related to body temperature, but and they'll burn more calories. They'll tend to be very, very lean and very intense and very energetic, right? And the opposite of all of that when somebody's hypothyroid. But part of the sort of the portfolio of symptoms of a disrupted thyroid is body temperature changes, or at least the perception of body temperature changes, and that is associated with all of those sort of more psychiatric components of disrupted thyroid, like being extremely stressed out. People who are hyperthyroid can be very, very like agitated. Not always, but and then people who are hypo can seem like they're just holding on, by the skin of their teeth, right? They're so tired, so lethargic, and there's no other reason other than this thyroid, this hormone is just not properly calibrated, right? And so yeah, you get a whole spectrum of behaviors that is not necessarily caused by disrupted body temperature, but that's a part of it, right?
Ian,
Yeah, and
what you're just saying is very much related to Gentleman Ghost's question here of behavior between, difference of behavior between hypothermia and hyperthermia. He says, an explanation that during extreme cold, humans will reach phase where they think they are warm and shed clothes. Is that the same with heat? Is it just delusional thinking? That's a good point. Yeah.
that's super interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know the mechanism of that. I don't think so. I don't. Well, certainly, people can experience, delusions, and hallucinations at very, very high temperatures, but also high, environmental temperatures. But I don't know that there is a consistent like body temperature related delusion where somebody gets so hot that they feel cold, right? As opposed to when somebody gets so cold that they feel hot. I actually don't know the mechanism underlying that. I don't know if it's, for example, a very acute or specific disruption of those thermoreceptors, right? And they're just functioning incorrectly, and so as a result, that the switch is broken or the sensor is broken, and so the brain is just like, well, we're hot now, right? I don't know if it's at that level. I don't know if it's at the level of the brain itself, where the mechanisms in the hypothalamus are disrupted by that temperature.
Right.
I would imagine if it's one, it's both. But that is interesting. I've never heard that is a consistent delusion associated with overly high temperatures. That is interesting. I'll have to look into that.
Good. It'll give us more grounds for more broadcasts for sure. Sure, more
Absolutely.
topics coming up. It's very, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Yep. Let's see one more from David here. I think the paradoxical undressing is due to the, what is it? I can't read the spinacles on the
Sphincters.
capillaries relaxing so that blood can go through the skin and one feels hot. Oh, I see what he's saying. Yes. Okay.
Interesting. I mean, okay, yeah, I could believe it, but I would imagine that there has to be something associated with the sensory component to it, because like, there's only so much body heat you can lose, right? And so, what David is saying is that, basically there's a lot of exposed, the blood that is, one of the conduits of body temperature in general, the heat, more of it is exposed to the environment. And so as a result, it can radiate more heat more effectively. But if you're at, let's say, 125 degrees Fahrenheit, that you're not going to be able to cool down, below that. You're not going to be able to cool down to a point where you like literally feel as though you're in the Arctic, right? But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I believe you. I should say that that happens, that dynamic happens. But I have to imagine that there's something sensory as well that occurs. And I'll have to look into that. That's an interesting dynamic. I didn't even think about looking into that.
Claudia comes up with an interesting thing. Now we come into gravity. This is going to be very interesting. Does gravitational force have an impact on the brain? I mean, the moon's gravitational pull that causes the tides, can it influence the brain by making particles in the brain to flow one direction or another? Any association between the moon's position and the mood has been scientifically established. Oh, well, I would I would wonder, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's funny. We could go in a lot of directions with that one, right? There's a whole industry devoted to moods changing as a function of the lunar cycles, right? So, Claudia, I mean, I have never heard that, so gravity certainly affects activity in the brain. There's no question about that, right? Where, because one of our senses, we have more than 5 senses, believe it or not, but one of them is a sensitivity to gravity, right? Yeah. To what direction is down. We have literal parts of our nervous system that are devoted to that. And it's a very sort of simple solution to this, where it's essentially, it's like a cup of sand, basically in our inner ear. It's called the vestibular system. Basically, that sand, like, just imagine I have a cup of sand, right? And, all the sand has settled to the bottom, and then I tilt it. All of a sudden the sand is going to fall into a new conformation because it's what's lowest within the cup, right? Same exact thing is going on within our ears right now. Like, the way I know that that's down is because I have these little, they're actually little, nuggets of shell, calcium carbonate, sort of like a seashell, right? And they accumulate in our ear, and then they tumble along these little hair cells. And so that's how we're sensitive to gravity. But I think what you're talking, you're more interested in something external, right? Like, let's say astronomical, right? Sources of gravity. I've never seen any evidence that that's the case, and frankly, I would be kind of surprised, because that something like that would evolve, unless we're talking about like the tidal forces of a black hole or something, right? But at that point, you have bigger
You
problems to deal with,
spaghettify,
because
right? You want it more.
yeah, exactly, right. But yeah, that's an interesting. I think a lot has been made, a lot of money has been made on claiming that you can predict certain things about a human's mood based off of the lunar cycle. I think there might be a simpler explanation that has more to do with sort of our natural body's cycles that occur, and every now and then it may phase lock with the lunar cycle, but more often than not, it's just we just have these cycles, these hormonal cycles, endocrine cycles that influence behavior, just thyroid, sex related hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Those have natural cycles that occur around the course of a month, or so, right? And so do lunar cycles, right? And so yeah, I don't think it's gravity that's causing that. I think it's more.
Yeah, I think the more
cycle.
relevant question may be: will our behavior change once we colonize the moon or we colonize Mars? I mean, that remains to be seen, right? I mean,
Yeah, totally. I mean,
yes,
and we do have sort of natural experiments, right, with astronauts that spend
yeah,
a year plus up in
yes,
in space.
space station.
They seem fine, right? There are a bunch of interesting things that happen to their body, right? But psychologically, independently of just like you only see the same people, the same like three other people every day for like a year. That has nothing to do with space, right? But they seem, their brains seem to function just fine, and so that would be my assumption, is that it's more although it's tough to know how the brain would develop in from start, right, from conception, how the nervous system would develop under the human nervous system under conditions of just totally different gravity, like the gravity of the moon. There have been, of course, experiments done where animals are bred, in like the International Space Station or something. But I could imagine there being some disruptions in nervous system development under conditions of low gravity. But generally speaking, I think the human brain can probably adapt.
Yes, yes. That's it's interesting. There's so much. I'm delighted to see there's so many comments that I can hardly catch up. So this is fantastic, to see what engagement there is. So this is obviously a topic that is of high interest. It's great to see.
So somebody's asking, Melinda's asking, Ian, is this Christian, the man who is so connected to the Eagles? I've been following him for years. This is Melinda Angler Juarez. Nice seeing you together. Yes, this is the one and the same. And yeah,
It's one and the
he's
same.
taking the
Yes.
best pictures of. He's taking the best pictures and videos of eagles that I've ever seen, birds in general.
Thank you.
But also his astrophotography is nothing to sneeze at. Some of the most beautiful viral images of the Milky Way that exist on the internet. So yeah, we are fortunate to be in his talented presence.
Well, thanks. I mean, the same goes for you, Ian. I'm absolutely delighted. I mean, my goodness, I've been watching you for years on Periscope, and finally we're doing something together. So this is absolutely wonderful.
Let's
what
do
an
it again.
opportunity. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's well, I mean, if if the viewers are interested, then Ian and I can do more together. I mean, a topic that would be interesting is, for example, the brain and the environment, the brain in the changing environment. Because I mean, there's so many changes going on, and people have just said it's gravity. It could be technology. Artificial intelligence. There's so many topics, and also experts out there. So if this is of interest, we could widen the scope. I don't know what you think, Ian, but that may be a possibility. So
I'm game. Absolutely.
yeah, good. Okay. So we'll take one last question here from Frank. What mostly brain activities raise brain temperatures to a significant degree? Oh, this is interesting. Like, would chess be raising the brain temperature, for example?
So right. So like what? Right. Well, obviously, exercise. Right. That would be the number one thing that causes changes in at least body temperature. What's interesting is we sort of weirdly don't know much about about specifically what causes changes
Mhm.
in brain temperature, if like that's what you're talking about, the first recordings of the temperature of a brain were done in the 1860s by a German physiologist, and I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Mortiz Schiff, or yeah, I don't know, M-O-R, oh no, Moritz Schiff,
Moritz, yeah.
M-O-R-I, no, Moritz, and so he was measuring brain temperatures, and that predated any actual electrical recordings of neuronal activity. And so neuroscience arguably started with temperature as its main mechanism that they measured. But so he identified an elevation of brain temperature in the brain of a dog after it was presented with some meat, right? It was sort of like a proto electrophysiology, right? They literally thought that measuring brain temperature might be a way to get a sense of what was going on in the brain under various circumstances, and this was just a presentation of some delicious food. And we know that the temperature in the brain can actually fluctuate pretty substantially under just normal conditions, right? And so like when animals, like us, of course, are presented with various stimuli, and there can be fluctuations in brain temperature, and some studies actually correlated changes in brain temperature to changes in EEG temperature, right? Meaning changes in electrical activity within the brain. So it's correlated, right? We don't know that there's a causative relationship. We don't know that the brain temperature is actually, causing these changes in the EEG recordings or vice versa. Probably a little bit of both. But it's a non-trivial thing. And so I can't tell you, Frank, that for sure, one activity will most definitely increase brain temperature. But there are activities that have been shown to do so. We're not talking about massive changes in temperature, of course, right? There's a very important window in which we need to stay. But yeah, certain activities and presentation to sensory stimuli definitely can influence brain temperature.
Very good. I think on that note, we've been busy for quite some time. So thank you all, everyone, for your wonderful questions and engagement. That's what we live on here. That's on what HAPS is all about. So thanks a lot. And many thanks to Ian to actually wanting to collaborate, which I really appreciate. That's wonderful.
It's seriously my pleasure, Christian. And yeah, let's do it again. And thank you so much for having me and for participating, everybody. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's part of what's kept me sane over the past year and a
Yes,
half, is being able to connect with all you lovely people. So
I
thanks again.
completely agree. It's very stimulating. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely rest of the weekend. Thank you.